Max and Mike were holding hands at the entrance of the orphanage, their hearts racing. 5 years. It had been 5 years of waiting, unanswered questions, and uncertainties, until finally, the moment had arrived. The phone, which so many times seemed to fail in bringing good news, now vibrated with a different sensation. This was the call that would change everything. Maxwell. Margot, our Margot, she's been cleared for adoption, Mike shouted, his eyes welling up, and his voice hoarse as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The world around them seemed like a blur, but in that moment, with the smile spreading from one corner of their faces to the other, nothing else mattered. They had the daughter they had dreamed of. With a nervous smile, Max nodded, giving Mike a quick kiss on the lips. "Let's go find our girl." The orphanage room was silent, except for the sound of children playing in the background and the ticking of a clock that seemed to drag on even longer in that moment. When Margot entered, with her curly blonde hair, simple dress, and eyes that seemed to shine with endless curiosity, Max and Mike stopped, stunned. She was too small, too fragile for what they were about to do. But there she was, and it was real. Their daughter. Margot seemed curious and cautious. But when she saw Max and Mike, something changed. She ran toward them without hesitation and clung to Mike's arm, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she wanted to be. "My God," Mike whispered. "She's perfect. She's ours." However, reality soon began to reveal itself in ways they hadn't imagined. That same night, as they left the orphanage, Mike and Max were met with harsh stares and quiet murmurs from some people on the street. A car passed quickly, and the driver stared at them, shaking her head as if she had seen something impure. An elderly lady on the sidewalk looked at them strangely. But nothing could erase the joy that overflowed in their hearts. "They don't know what it means to be a family," Max said, holding Margot tightly, but his voice carried a tone of anger he hadn't known he was carrying. In the early days, the battle against rejection seemed relentless. They began to realize that the people around them weren't willing to accept the union of two men, let alone the fact that these two men had adopted a white girl. A coffee vendor at a local bakery refused to serve them, arguing that it was too strange a family to be real. On social media, a public debate erupted about the disruption of the natural order of things, with many posting hateful comments. The look that Max and Mike exchanged during these moments wasn't one of anger but of exhaustion. Exhaustion from a daily battle that seemed never ending. But there was no turning back. They had Margot, and they were a family, and no one, was going to take her from them. The next morning, the day seemed promising. The sun was still low, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as Mike prepared breakfast. Margot was in the living room, playing with the toys they had bought for her at the local toy store. Her laughter was small but happy, as if she had finally found a place where she could feel at home. But soon, reality asserted itself again. Max, who was on the porch with his coffee, saw a neighbor, an older woman with graying hair and linen clothes, walking down the sidewalk. She stopped in front of their house and watched them with a tense expression, almost as if she were waiting for something. Max tried to smile, but she simply turned her face and walked away without saying a word. The weight of her gaze stayed with him. "I can't pretend this isn't happening anymore," Max said, placing the coffee on the table. "People aren't just going to accept us. They won't." Mike, with tired eyes from a sleepless night, nodded, but didn't say anything. He knew Max was right. Their love, their life, all of it was being tested, and not everyone was willing to accept it. Margot entered the kitchen, wearing a simple pajama, but her eyes were shining with curiosity. She looked at the two of them, and on her small face was an expression Max and Mike couldn't read. But it made them realize how much their lives, somehow, were still being shaped by something bigger than all the world's challenges. She didn't know, but at that innocent age, she was already immersed in a world that questioned the very notion of family. "Daddy, what's this?" she asked, pointing to the wedding photo on the living room wall, where Max and Mike were in suits, smiling. Max smiled, but the pain was there, behind his eyes. "It's a picture from when we got married," he replied. "We made a promise, Margot. A promise to love each other forever." She seemed thoughtful for a moment, but soon returned to her play, unaware of the weight of that question. But Max knew. He knew that sooner or later, she would ask more. He knew that society would judge her, and that their path wouldn't be easy. The neighbors' look, the words exchanged in the workplace hallways, the whispered conversations in restaurant corners, all of it wasn't just a reflection of ignorance. It was a storm about to approach. In the afternoon, Max and Mike took Margot to the park, their hearts still tight from the strangeness of the interactions. As they walked by the playground, a woman approached and looked directly at them. "Excuse me, but are you a family?" she asked with a forced smile. The way the word family left her lips had something strange about it, something Max couldn't immediately explain. "Yes, we are a family," Ike answered, his voice firm but not hiding the tension in his body. The woman laughed, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, of course. Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I've never seen something like this around here." Max felt the heat rising to his head, and Mike discreetly squeezed his hand. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew every step they took would be watched, analyzed, questioned. But seeing Margot look at them with those curious eyes, not understanding what was happening, made Max breathe deeply. "It doesn't matter what they say, Max," Mike murmured, more to himself. "She's our daughter, and that's all that matters." But what they didn't know was that the first attacks would come from where they least expected. At night, when they were having dinner at the small dining table, Max's phone rang. He looked at the unknown number on the screen, suspicious. He answered. "Hi, Max. This is John from the law office. I need to talk to you about the adoption case," said the voice on the other side. "There are some complications." Max's stomach turned in a way he couldn't explain. "Complications? Yes. The whole thing is being contested. There's a local movement questioning the adoption of children by same-sex couples. The pressure is building, and we're seeing some objections arise. You'll need to be prepared." Max looked at Mike, who was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The worst was yet to come. It wouldn't just be the strange looks from people on the street. Now, there was something bigger, something institutionalized, trying to separate them from Margot. He knew the fight was just beginning. The following days were marked by tension, as Max and Mike tried to focus on giving Margot a normal life. The problems were piling up. Anonymous letters began to arrive, with words of hate and threats. People in stores and restaurants looked at them with a kind of pity, as if they were doing something wrong. Even the manager of the restaurant they used to go to on weekends started giving lame excuses when they tried to make a reservation. The pain of seeing Margot grow up in such a world seemed unbearable. And there was something more. The constant fear that one day she would be questioned about who her parents were, and how she would react when she discovered that the world was so willing to judge them. "Do you think we'll make it, Mike? Do you think this will be possible?" Max asked, his voice low, unable to hide the desperation. Mike looked into his eyes. "Yes, it will be possible, Max, because no matter what the world says, we are a family, and we always will be." But as much as they tried to convince themselves, they knew this battle wouldn't be easy. And what they couldn't predict was that, within this storm, it would be Margot and her courage who, in the end, would change everything. Max and Mike's life, which for a brief moment seemed perfect, began to unravel like a house of cards in the wind. The fight to keep their family united and safe from society's criticisms was becoming harder by the day. What had once been a journey of love and happiness was now transforming into a constant battle against the prejudices ingrained in the people around them. In Max's office, where he managed his own graphic design company, things were also starting to tighten up. He noticed that some of his longtime clients began to pull away. They didn't say it directly, but the silence, short messages, and unanswered emails spoke volumes. He knew this was a result of his relationship with Mike and the adoption of Margot. One afternoon, while Max was meeting with an important client, a bulky man in a dark suit named Steven, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. Max was explaining some details about a new project when Steven interrupted. "Max, you've been doing good work, but, I think our clients aren't completely comfortable with your company's image lately," Steven said, with a forced smile, but a clearly uncomfortable look. "This adoption thing. You know, it's complicated for some." Max felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to mask it, but the blow was direct. He knew Steven was referring to Mike, to Margot, to his family, something he tried to keep separate from his work. But now, it was invading his professional life in a brutal way. He took a deep breath before responding. "Steven, personal life has nothing to do with the business we do here. I'm a professional, and that's how you should see me." Steven hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, and the silence in the room was awkward. But the message was clear. Max felt the pain of seeing his own principles questioned in such a subtle, yet aggressive, way. Later, when he told Mike what had happened, he realized there was no longer any escape from that reality. Every day, society demanded more from him, more justifications, more explanations, more apologies for existing. At Margot's school, the pressure also started to manifest. She, who had once been a curious and energetic girl, began to show signs of being quieter and more reserved. When she came home after school, there was a sadness in her face, a change that Max couldn't ignore. "Daddy, why did the other kids look at me like that?" Margot asked one afternoon while they were in the kitchen preparing dinner. Her eyes were filled with a wounded innocence, something Max never wanted her to understand so soon. Max looked at Mike, who wore the same worried expression. The answer seemed difficult, but he knew he had to be honest, even if it was with simple words. "Margot, people sometimes don't understand what family is. And some people are really scared of what's different. But what matters is that we love you, and that will never change. And we will always protect you, no matter what others say or think." Margot didn't fully understand, but her expression softened a little. She gave a small smile, but the pain in Max's eyes was impossible to hide. With each new challenge, Max and Mike found themselves more connected than ever. The fight for acceptance, for dignity, and for their daughter's safety became their top priority. But the weight of external threats and social pressure began to affect them, especially Max, who felt himself crumbling with each cruel look and every word whispered behind their backs. Meanwhile, at school, Margot began to hear jokes and comments from other children. One of the boys in her class, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy, began to call Margot adopted in a derogatory manner, using it as a way to undermine her and try to push her out of the group. He said Margot wasn't really part of the family and that she was different from the other kids. The first time she told Max and Mike what was happening at school, their hearts almost stopped. She wasn't just suffering from the racial prejudice that she barely understood, but also from the exclusion caused by the combination of her color and adoption. The radiant smile she always wore now seemed like a reflection of hidden pain. "Daddy, why does Billy call me adopted?" Margot asked, her eyes filled with tears. Mike was the first to react. He knelt beside her, stroking her hair. "Because he doesn't understand. And you know, when people don't understand, sometimes they act ignorantly. But you are our daughter, Margot. You belong to us. And that will never change." Max, who had been silent until then, felt a lump in his throat. He wanted more than anything to protect Margot from all the evil the world imposed on her. But he knew the biggest battle would be helping her rise up, value herself, and understand the true meaning of family. As night fell, and Margot went to bed, Max and Mike sat on the couch, exchanging worried looks. They knew that now, the real challenge was just beginning. A few days later, Max received an unexpected visit. A school representative, a gray-haired man with a firm expression, arrived at their house for a conversation. He seemed concerned, but also determined. Mike, I need to talk to you about Margot," he began bluntly. "We've received some complaints. Some children are feeling uncomfortable with her presence at school, and it seems like the situation is getting worse." Max felt a pang in his chest. He knew he couldn't allow the school to do anything that put his daughter at risk. But what he didn't expect was that what was coming would be more than just a common complaint. "She's being bullied, not just by the children, but also by some of the parents. And the administration is considering transferring her to another school, something more appropriate for her." The words hit Max like a slap in the face. Not only was prejudice infiltrating the school, but the administration seemed to support this form of exclusion. But Max wasn't willing to let that happen. He knew that, this time, the fight would be fiercer, and he was determined not to give in. "We're not allowing this," Max said, his voice firm. "Margot belongs to this school just as much as any other child, and we won't let anyone make her feel inferior." The representative tried to apologize, but Max wasn't listening anymore. He already knew what he needed to do, and when Mike walked into the room, with a determined look, Max knew he was ready to fight. For Margot, for them, and for everything the word family truly meant. The following days became a chaotic mix of difficult decisions and silent battles. At work, Max felt the judging eyes as he found himself more isolated. Even close colleagues began making excuses to avoid a coffee or a meeting. A subtle way of distancing themselves. Every little change in the environment seemed to echo the weight of his identity and his choices. Meanwhile, Mike, who had always been calm and measured, tried to focus on the small victories. He began dedicating more time to his yoga practice, looking for a way to maintain inner peace amid the external storms. But it wasn't enough to erase the pain he saw in Max's eyes, and the growing emptiness spreading in his own soul. They knew that racism and homophobia were hitting them hard, but what hurt the most was seeing their daughter, Margot, absorbing that poison. Margot began to withdraw, becoming quieter and quieter. When she wasn't with her parents, she would hide in her room, dealing with the cruel comments from school. The bullying was no longer limited to a simple joke. She was being dehumanized, treated like something strange, as if her presence was something the others had to tolerate and not accept. One afternoon, Max came home and found Margot sitting on the porch, alone, with her eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew she was trying to cope with the weight of being so small, yet having to carry such a heavy burden of prejudice. He approached and sat beside her, without saying a word. It was as if she knew, without needing explanations, that he also felt her pain. "Daddy, why are people afraid of me?" Margot asked suddenly, her voice as soft as a breeze. The words she spoke were so simple, but carried a weight Max could never imagine. He took a deep breath, running a hand through her hair. There was no easy answer, but he knew he had to be strong, not just for her, but also for himself and Mike. "Margot, people are afraid of what they don't understand. They don't know how amazing you are, how much you teach us every day, but what you have inside you, the love, the kindness, the courage, that's not something anyone can take from you. No matter what they say, we are a family, and that's stronger than anything." The words seemed to ease some of the weight in her heart, but Max knew this relief was temporary. The fight wouldn't end there, and he felt a growing frustration. What more could he do to protect Margot? How far would his own patience and faith go? The next day, the true test of their strength as a family came. It was a school meeting scheduled to discuss Margot's behavior with her parents and the administration. When Max and Mike arrived, they were prepared to fight. But what they didn't expect was that the attack would come from within the school itself. The meeting was marked by a tense atmosphere and a series of justifications trying to soften the prejudice. "We need to be realistic, Max and Mike. Margot is a wonderful child, no doubt about it, but she's becoming a point of contention among the other children. We can't ignore the situation any longer. She's, in some way, affecting the harmony of the class." One of the administrators, the assistant principal, spoke as though it were a sentence, as if the problem's origin was simply Margot's presence there. Max felt a wave of indignation, but tried to stay calm. Mike, on the other hand, could no longer hold back what was building up inside him. "Are you saying that Margot, a 7-year-old child, is harming the harmony of the class? What kind of harmony is this, where a child is excluded for being different? For being loved in a way you don't understand?" Mike exploded, and his words came out like a burst of fire. The assistant principal looked uncomfortable, and the meeting quickly turned into a battleground. Max tried to steer the conversation back on track, but it was difficult when the words tangled with prejudices disguised as educational concerns. He had never imagined he would need to fight so hard for something as basic as Margot's right to simply exist. By the end of the meeting, A sense of defeat hung in the air. The best they managed was a vague compromise, a more detailed assessment of the situation, where Margot would have a chance to stay in school, but on the condition that she passed through a series of integration and social adjustment sessions. Max and Mike knew this was nothing more than an attempt to fix what was seen as an anomaly. The following night, the couple sat in silence. The weight of the meeting still hovered over them. Mike, who was usually the calmer one, tried to find some inner peace, but couldn't shake off the anger consuming him. Max, on the other hand, was in defense mode, his mind restless, filled with plans and strategies, yet none of them seemed good enough to protect their daughter. And then, when it seemed like all hope was lost, something happened. Max received an unexpected call from an old friend, Chris, a civil rights lawyer who knew about Max and Mike's struggle and was willing to help. "Max, I've seen what's happening, and believe me, this story could be bigger than you think. We can use this as a turning point. I can help you sue the school for discrimination. I can help Margot fight for her rights, for her dignity. We won't let anyone destroy what you have." These words sparked a flame of hope in Max. They were about to begin a legal battle, but something deeper, something Margot could learn from all of this, began to take shape in his mind. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about all those who would one day have to face the world alone, carrying the weight of prejudice. But what Max and Mike didn't know yet was that the real twist was about to happen. And as always, their fight would be at the heart of something that could change everything. The tension in the days following the school meeting was palpable in every corner of the house. Max and Mike barely spoke to each other. The silence is heavy, and the air seemed more oppressive than ever. Margot, in turn, felt the weight of her parents' frustration and, at the same time, the pain of what she had lived through at school. She, who had always been a curious and lively girl, now walked around the house with slumped shoulders and her head down, as if she were starting to believe the cruel words others had said to her. It was one morning, during a quiet breakfast, when Chris, Max's lawyer friend, called again. He sounded more determined than ever. "Max, you're not alone in this. I've contacted other families who've gone through something similar, and the response is starting to form. Now, we need to act quickly. We can't wait any longer. Let's take this fight forward. Let's fight for Margot, but also for all the other children who are invisible in this process. What you have here is much more than an adoption issue. It's a matter of dignity." Max stood up abruptly, his eyes burning with renewed fire. Something was changing inside him. The frustration, the anger, the pain, everything was mixing into a wave of action he didn't know he was capable of generating. But he wasn't fighting just for Margot. He was fighting for something greater. He was fighting for a future where love, in whatever form it appeared, would be accepted and respected. Mike looked at Max, his eyes still tired, but there was something there, a spark he knew well. Max's courage was overflowing. He silently raised his hand, as if asking for a pause, and then said, with uncommon serenity, "I know this fight is going to be long, Max. But we've been through a lot together, and we won't give up. Margot has the right to grow up in a world that accepts her for who she is, and we have the right to be her family. We won't let them take that from us." Max took a deep breath and nodded. He knew he was on the right path, but he also felt that the truth about what they were facing went deeper than he had imagined. The legal process was about to begin, but with it came new challenges. The support of other families who had faced discrimination was crucial, but the pressure on the school and society was mounting. Max and Mike began receiving threats, anonymous messages, and nasty letters left at their doorstep. It all seemed like an attempt to weaken the movement, to undermine their strength, but each hateful word only motivated them to fight harder. As the case unfolded, Margot continued to be a target. She, a 7-year-old girl, was called many names at school, and the impact of that started to reflect in her personality. Margot became more reclusive, more distant, and that worried her parents. Max felt a constant anguish, a tightness in his chest, not knowing how to protect his daughter from the invisible wounds the world was inflicting on her. He wondered how much more she could endure before breaking. On one of these turbulent afternoons, Max decided he needed to do something to show Margot that she wasn't alone, that she didn't have to face the world by herself. He took her to the park, where they used to go when she was younger. The playfulness and laughter had given way to uncomfortable silence, but Max knew he needed to bring back that spark she had. Something that would remind her of who she was. "Margot, do you remember that game of hide and seek we always used to play? I always tried to catch you, but you were so good you never let me." Max smiled, trying to break the ice. "I never gave up, did I? I always went after you, until I found you. And you know, in the end, when we find each other, it's like the waiting was worth it. That's how I feel with you. No matter what the world says, I'll always find you. I'll always support you." Margot looked at her father, and something changed in her eyes. It was as if, for a brief moment, she had found again the comfort she had been seeking. She hugged him, without saying a word, but in that hug, there was something deeper than any gesture. It was as if their love was a fortress, a refuge where cruel words had no power. But while Max and Mike tried to rebuild their daughter, the outside world continued to pressure. The legal case was taking on larger proportions than they had imagined. And soon, it became a symbol of the fight for civil rights for non-traditional families. Various groups began to take positions, some supporting the cause, others attacking with more ferocity. This created a tense atmosphere, where the attacks became more personal and visceral. And at the height of this struggle, an unexpected twist happened. During an important hearing, the school's defense attorney made a shocking accusation. Max and Mike weren't actually Margot's biological parents. She suggested that, because they were black and gay, they were trying to force a family model that society wasn't ready to accept. She insinuated that Margot's adoption was an attempt at a social experiment, an effort to challenge traditional norms. The accusation dropped like a bomb in the courtroom, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Max and Mike were paralyzed, incredulous at what they had just heard. But instead of succumbing to despair, something inside Max ignited. He stood up and, with surprising strength, responded with the conviction he had been saving for that moment. "We are Margot's parents, not because we want to challenge society, but because we love her. We chose her, and she chose us. This is our bond. We are no threat to anyone. We are a family, and no accusation, no slander will change that." Max's words reverberated through the room, and that unexpected moment became the turning point in the case. He knew the fight was far from over, but something had shifted. The truth was being spoken, and the power of love was taking its rightful place. The impact of the school's lawyer's accusation still echoed in Max's mind. He knew the battle was just beginning, but the weight of the lawyer's words hadn't left his head. The accusations were hitting a sensitive spot, and to him, it seemed like all the progress they had made was being undermined by an outdated and cruel idea. Margot, on one side, didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but she felt the change in her parents' behavior. Once always so warm, Max and Mike were now more distant, too busy with legal meetings, phone calls, and the constant media pressure. She knew something was wrong. The smiles they used to share, the jokes during dinner, began to disappear, replaced by anxious silences and discussions about what to do, what to say. And then, on a rainy afternoon, when Max was returning from a particularly difficult meeting with the lawyer Chris, he received a text message from Mike, something simple, but it made his heart race. It was a picture of Margot, with a drawing on the living room table. She was smiling, with a calm and focused expression. Next to it, in small letters, the caption, "I love you, Daddy." The image of his daughter, so full of hope, was a reminder of why they were fighting. It was for her happiness, for her freedom. The anger that had arisen from the lawyer's accusation turned into renewed fuel. He looked at the phone and took a deep breath. Mike came home shortly after, and when they saw each other, there was a silent exchange of glances that said more than any word could. Max looked at Margot's drawing, and a sense of certainty took over him. "We're not going to let them tell us what our family should be, Mike. We won't let this case define who we are." Mike nodded, but there was a glint of worry in his eyes. He knew the pressure was mounting, and increasingly, the threats to the family's safety were becoming real. They had already received anonymous letters and phone calls, but the situation was becoming more personal. When an unknown woman approached Max in a supermarket and whispered in his ear, "Your place is in prison," something inside him broke. Max knew they were in a much bigger war than they had imagined. But what was happening in court at that moment was even more devastating. Society's support was splitting. Many saw the case as a step forward in the fight for equality, but many others were using Max and Mike's case as a symbol of everything they thought was wrong with the modernization of families. Some headlines in the newspapers were blunt: "Unconventional adoption family puts society in doubt," or "Homosexual couple and white child adoption, a social experiment." The pressure was overwhelming. Inside the courtroom, the words from the school's lawyer were still fresh, and the case was dragging into a series of defamatory allegations against the couple. What once seemed like a battle for Margot's adoption now became a matter of values. The war between defenders of Lobtkia plus family rights and those who believed traditional family should be preserved was becoming increasingly polarized. Max and Mike felt the battle was beyond the courtroom. With every meeting, every anonymous letter, every comment on social media, they were challenged to prove that the love they had for Margot was real, legitimate, and worthy of respect. But it wasn't just others who were questioning their relationship, there were also internal doubts. Max, especially, felt a weight on his shoulders. He wasn't as afraid of the courtroom as he was afraid that Margot, over time, might start questioning whether she really deserved all of this. "Do you think we're doing the right thing, Max? I'm starting to wonder if this is going to end up destroying her," Mike said one night while they tried to sleep. But the exhaustion and stress had taken over both of them. Max looked at him, his expression distant, as if trying to organize his thoughts. "We know what we're doing, Mike. We're giving her a future where she can be whoever she wants to be, without fear of being who she is. That's what matters." Margot was listening to their conversation from the hallway. And although she didn't understand everything, something inside her felt the pain and love her parents were carrying. That night, she approached them with the drawing she had made, the simple "I love you, Daddy," still on the table. She placed the drawing in Max's hand and, with a shy smile, said, "I know you're going to make it. It won't be easy, but love will win." That deeply moved Max. In a moment of pure vulnerability, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for a matter of rights. He was fighting for his daughter's right to grow up in a world where love was more important than any skin color or sexual orientation. However, when the trial was nearing its end, the opposing lawyer made one last attempt to turn the tide. He brought in a witness, a specialized psychiatrist, to claim that children adopted by same-sex couples were more likely to suffer psychological trauma. The witness's words seemed unshakable. It was a dirty attempt to invalidate Max and Mike's relationship, and to question Margot's mental health. But at the end of the hearing, Chris, Max and Mike's lawyer, raised a surprise card. A series of testimonies from other children adopted by same-sex couples, all presenting a clear account. The trauma didn't come from being adopted by same-sex couples, but from the social barriers and prejudice they faced in the outside world. The legal battle was finally starting to turn in their favor. However, Max knew that this victory in court wouldn't be the end. The hardest part was still ahead. The day-to-day of Margot growing up in a world where, despite all the love, she would still be an exception. But he was determined to make sure she grew up in a world where she was accepted. Not for who she was, but for who she loved. In the days following the final hearing, Max and Mike felt the weight of a battle not yet won. While the trial seemed to be heading toward a possible legal victory, what was truly at stake was much deeper and more complex. Society, neighbors, friends, and even the closest people still didn't fully accept the family model they had formed. Margot, in turn, was beginning to realize that the world around her wasn't as she had imagined. The looks on the streets, the whispers at school, the way some kids avoided making friends with her, all of this became more evident as she grew older. She tried to understand, but little by little, a feeling of loneliness began to take over her life. And she started to wonder if her parents' love would be enough to protect her from all of it. At home, Max and Mike did their best to ensure Margot felt supported, but the pressure was mounting. Mike, the more sensitive one, noticed the changes in their daughter more than Max. He saw her isolated in her room, with her drawings and reflections, and feared that the emotional scars of prejudice couldn't be healed so easily. "We can't just keep letting all of this slide, Max. She needs support. She needs to understand that this isn't her fault. But we also need to help her be strong enough to face what's to come," said in a conversation, his voice trembling but firm. Max, always the more rational one, tried to find practical solutions, as if this were a matter of strategic planning. "We'll give her time, Mike. She needs to live with this, needs to understand what it means to grow up in a family like ours. And we'll be here all the time. We won't give up. Never." The tension between them grew as obstacles multiplied. Lawyers on both sides prepared their final moves, and as the final trial approached, new revelations came to light, forcing Max and Mike to reevaluate their own beliefs and the impact of what they were living. One night, after another meeting with the lawyer, Max came home and found Mike sitting at the table, with a vacant look. He was holding a letter, seemingly official. When Max approached, Mike looked at him with a sad smile and said, "The letter came. It's from the government. They want us to prove that our home is stable enough for Margot to continue living here." "And now, Max, what are we going to do? How do we prove that our love is enough?" Those words cut like a blade. They had already overcome so many barriers, dealt with so much prejudice, but now a new accusation had arisen. They were being questioned not for being loving parents, but for the very structure of their family. What seemed like a simple adoption process had turned into a fight for dignity. The next morning, Max and Mike decided to take Margot to a nearby park, where she always loved to play. They wanted her to feel the freedom of being a child, without the pressures they were placing on her. But when they arrived at the park, something unexpected happened. They were walking down a tree-lined path when they heard a familiar voice, but laced with strangeness. It was the mother of one of Margot's classmates, a woman who had always been cordial, but now seemed distant and uncomfortable. "Max, Mike, I need to talk to you," she said, with visible hesitation. I don't know if my husband and I can keep letting our daughters play with Margot. Things are getting too complicated and..." She stopped, not knowing how to continue. Max and Mike exchanged looks full of frustration, but tried to remain calm. "I understand you have your concerns," Max said, controlling his anger, "but don't tell us what our daughters can or can't do. What we can't accept is the idea that, because we have a different family, that could harm Margot. We're parents like any other, and she has every right to be happy." The woman seemed speechless, but before she could respond, Margot ran up to them, a wide smile on her face, unaware of the tension. She was holding a flower in her hands and shouted, "Look what I found! A purple flower! Look how beautiful it is!" Max looked at his daughter, with his heart aching, and said, "Yes, dear, it's beautiful, just like you." At that moment, Max and Mike knew they were at the center of a storm, but they also knew they couldn't let little Margot be swept away by it. She wasn't at fault for what the world thought. She wasn't at fault for the love her parents felt for her, nor the prejudice they faced. The battle in the courtroom was nearing its end, and the final hearing was approaching. The tension was reflected in the streets, in the cafes, in the furtive conversations. Max and Mike were preparing for the final move, aware that they were not only defending the right to adopt, but defending the right to be a family, the right to exist in a society that was not ready to accept the simplest truth of all. Love has no color and no limitations. On the eve of the final trial, Max couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about all they had been through. As the sound of the fan filled the silent night, he thought about Margot's words, the purple flower, and the promise he and Mike had made to her. No matter what the world thought, they would continue fighting, to the end. The day of the final trial arrived like a heavy cloud, ready to burst. Max and Mike, though visibly tired and tense, were determined to show the world that their family deserved to be recognized, respected, and protected. They were aware that this would not just be a legal battle, but a fight for dignity and the fundamental rights that everyone should have, regardless of skin color, sexual orientation, or family structure. The courtroom was full, with the heavy atmosphere and judgmental glances. Max and Mike's lawyer, William, seemed more focused than ever. He knew that to win, he would need to present more than just legal arguments. He needed to show that love is an immeasurable right that transcends any category or limit imposed by society. The air was thick, and the presence of media representatives made everything even more impersonal and inhumane. When the judge entered the room, everyone stood up. The courtroom was in absolute silence. Max sat next to Mike, who was gripping his hand tightly, his nervousness written on his face. Margot was next to a friend her parents had brought to accompany her, but the girl, with her bright eyes, was clearly restless. She knew something important was happening, something that would change her life, and perhaps her entire family's. The prosecution, represented by a lawyer who defended a conservative view on adoption and non-traditional families, was direct and incisive. They questioned the emotional stability of a child growing up in a home like Max and Mike's, suggesting that the absence of a biological mother posed a risk to Margot's psychological development. The arguments were veiled and disguised, but the message was clear. People like Max and Mike were not seen as capable of providing the ideal environment for a child. Max and Mike's lawyer, William, countered forcefully, emphasizing that the issue was not about their client's sexual orientation or the color of their skin, but about the fact that Max and Mike were loving parents who had spent 5 years trying to adopt a child, and throughout that time, had shown emotional stability and an unwavering commitment to Margot's well-being. What we're debating here isn't about the type of family Max and Mike formed, but about what is best for Margot, William said firmly. And I asked the court, what is better for a child? Growing up in a home where love and acceptance are present, or living in a society that cannot recognize the value of these families? Love has no color, no shape, no limits. Love is the foundation of a family, and this family, gentlemen, is the true definition of stability. As the trial unfolded, Margot remained distant from the direct attention of the court, but her gaze, though silent, reflected the anguish of the moment. She knew what was at stake, but at the same time, she couldn't understand why a family full of love was being questioned. When it was her turn to speak, Margot was called upon. Although she might have seemed too innocent a child to understand the complexities of the situation, she surprised everyone with her words. I'm happy with my parents. They love me and make me feel special. It doesn't matter the color of their skin or mine. What matters is that they've taught me what it means to be someone who can fight for what they believe in. And I believe in them. They showed me the true meaning of family. They are my family, and that's what matters. Max and Mike were visibly moved. It was one of the few times when the purity of a child, free from society's constraints, had the power to make clear what was truly at stake. Everyone in the courtroom turned their gaze to little Margot, who had, unintentionally, said something much deeper than any legal argument. She wasn't just defending her parents, she was defending the very essence of what it meant to be a family. The judge, visibly touched, called for a break to reflect on what had been said. During the break, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, but at the same time, there was a glimmer of hope. Max and Mike, though feeling the weight of their words, now knew they were on the right path. When the trial resumed, the judge declared that the case would be further reviewed. He had been impressed by Margot's sincerity and the strength of the argument presented by William. It was rare to see such a young child speak so clearly about what it meant to be part of a family, and this had deeply moved the court. Hours passed before the final verdict was delivered. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was palpable. Everyone eagerly awaited the decision. When the judge finally stood to announce the sentence, an absolute silence filled the room. After careful consideration of all aspects of this case, and taking into account the arguments presented, I declare that the adoption of Margot by Max and Mike is completely valid. There is no legal, moral, or social reason to prevent this union. What we have witnessed here is the demonstration of unconditional love and the right of a child to be raised in an environment that provides love and security, The judge's words sounded like music in Max and Mike's ears. They had won. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a victory for the truth, for love, and for the right to exist as a family, without submitting to society's rigid and inhumane expectations. Margot ran to her parents, her eyes shining with happiness, and in that moment, the world seemed like a slightly better place. After the favorable verdict, Max, Mike, and Margot's lives changed irreversibly, but not in the way they had imagined. The victory in court was a milestone, but as they soon discovered, the battle for acceptance was far from over. The day after the verdict, Max's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages of support and congratulations mixed with aggressive criticisms and veiled threats. The media, which had been focused on the trial, now descended upon the family with an almost voyeuristic interest. For many, the court victory was an example of overcoming adversity, but for others, it was an affront to the traditional norms society was still trying to preserve. Max's office was filled with documents and phone calls, and he felt the weight of William's words, his lawyer, echoing in his mind. "Now that you've won, Max, we can't relax. This is just the beginning. The world is watching. We can't let anyone bring us down." On the other hand, was more concerned about Margot. The children at school started asking questions, some out of curiosity, not understanding what had happened, others with the cruelty of those who repeat what they hear at home. Max noticed Margot's reserved behavior, as she didn't usually talk much about the challenges she faced, but now she seemed more introspective. The spark in her eyes, which had always been a reflection of curiosity and life, seemed to have lost some of its intensity. "Daddy, do you think people will ever understand that you love me, no matter what they say about us?" Margot asked one day while playing with her dog in the yard. Max crouched down. Kneeling beside her, he stroked her hair and looked deeply into her eyes. "I think the world is more confused than we'd like, Margot. But one thing I can promise you, the love we have for each other is stronger than anything anyone can say or think. That won't change, no matter what happens." These words, spoken with such affection and conviction, were the only certainty Margot had at that moment. But at school, things were getting complicated. Some children began to distance themselves, others, bolder, mocked Margot and her parents. A student from the school, Linda, the daughter of one of the most conservative figures in the community, made a post on social media calling the family dysfunctional and wrong. The post went viral quickly, and soon other children started following Linda's example. Max and Mike were in the middle of a storm of hate that spread through the streets of the city, through the halls of Margot's school, and through WhatsApp groups exchanging messages full of prejudice. Max tried to ignore the messages, but he couldn't escape the burden of seeing his daughter become the target of such cruel attacks. He decided to talk to the school, asking for intervention to protect Margot and ensure she wasn't a victim of bullying. However, the principal, though diplomatic, seemed hesitant. He seemed to want to maintain appearances, avoiding confrontation with the more conservative parents who were the pillars of the community. "I understand, Max, but we need to act with caution. What we're facing is not just a school issue, but something much bigger, and anything we do could affect the school's image," said the principal, a middle-aged man who, despite his formal education, was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Max felt a growing frustration. The attempt to do things the right way, within the rules, seemed more and more futile. He looked at Mike, and both knew that, once again, they would be forced to fight for something that should be natural, their daughter's right to live with dignity and without fear. That's when Mike had an idea. "Why don't we go straight to the root of it all? Let's organize a community meeting. Invite people to hear our story and talk about what we're going through. It won't be easy, but maybe it'll help clarify things. After all, no one will understand until they see it with their own eyes." Max liked the idea. Although they knew facing hatred directly could be dangerous, they also knew they needed to respond publicly. Not just to the people attacking Margot, but to the entire community. They needed to show, without a shadow of a doubt, that their family was as legitimate as any other, and that there was no room for prejudice. At the meeting, held in a community hall, Max and Mike shared their journey, their struggles, their fears, and most importantly, their love for Margot. It was a night of emotional revelations, during which many community members who had previously been silent or indifferent began to rethink their attitudes. Some admitted that they had never considered adoption as a legitimate way to form a family, and others, more skeptical, began to question why they felt so much prejudice against something that didn't directly affect their lives. Margot, who had initially felt shy in front of all those eyes, gathered the courage to stand up in the middle of the meeting and say, "I just want to be happy. I just want people to see that my parents are good and love me. What else matters?" Her words, so simple and pure, touched the hearts of many present. Some cried, others stood in silence, but everyone was moved by the sincerity and wisdom of a child who, despite everything, knew more about the world than many adults. Over time, the impact of the meeting began to spread. The community, which had initially seemed divided, began to unite around the idea of acceptance. The school, under pressure, adopted new anti-bullying policies and began to offer psychological support to Margot and other children facing similar situations. Linda, the student who had started the wave of attacks, publicly apologized to Margot, and many of her peers began to rethink their attitudes. Despite everything, the journey was not over. The legal victory in court was important, but the real work lay in changing the minds and hearts of the people around them. Margot was growing, learning to be strong, to fight for herself and for others. And Max and Mike were there, by her side, not only as parents, but as tireless defenders of a simple yet revolutionary idea, that everyone has the right to be loved and to form a family, regardless of any barrier society tries to impose. The year passed quickly. But for Max, Mike, and Margot, time seemed to drag like a slow river. The struggle that began with huge challenges and constant confrontations now seemed to finally be bearing fruit. The scars of prejudice were still there, but they weren't as deep or painful as before. The family had found a way to rebuild, not just as individuals, but as a strong and unbreakable unit. Margot was now in high school. She had become a brilliant young woman with an indomitable spirit and a growing passion for justice. Her desire to fight for others, for those still being marginalized, had become her mission. She enrolled in a law course to learn how to defend the rights of those who, like her, once needed someone to fight for them. The city, which had once been a battleground, began to transform. The attacks of racism and prejudice gave way to more constructive dialogues. Many families, who had previously kept their distance or remained indifferent, began to approach Max, Mike, and Margot. Conversations about adoption, diversity in families, and the right to happiness became more common in cafes, on the streets, and even in schools. The community was growing, learning to embrace what was once seen as different. It was on one of these afternoons, while they were having coffee at the Morning Brew, a local cafe, that Max and Mike talked about how things had changed. "Can you believe we've come this far?" Mike asked, looking out the cafe window, watching the passers-by on the sidewalk. Max smiled, though with a thoughtful look. The weight of the journey was still there, but there was also a relief in knowing that, finally, things were falling into place. "I believe it. And more importantly, Margot believes it. She's becoming who she always wanted to be, and our struggle was part of that. Even on the tough days, she never lost hope, and neither did we." His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Margot, who was in college, and although she was in a new phase of life, she always remembered her parents. "Dad, you and Dad Max are the greatest role models I've ever had. I'll keep fighting for everyone who needs a voice. Thank you for teaching me to fight." Max looked at the screen and couldn't hold back the tears that quickly filled his eyes. It was a mix of joy and pride, a reflection of everything that had been accomplished. The following year, Margot was called for an internship at a legal organization that fought for the rights of LGBTQ+ families and the social inclusion of adopted children. It was an unexpected invitation, but she accepted with a confident smile on her face. She knew her work was just beginning, but more than ever, she felt that her mission in life was clear. She wanted to make a difference, not only for others, but for herself and her family. Because, in a way, all the challenges she had faced had been catalysts for her to become stronger and more determined. One night, in the city center, during a ceremony honoring civil rights defenders, Max and Mike were called to the stage. It wasn't a formal award or anything grand, but a sincere recognition from all the people who had been touched by their story. Max, with his firm and emotional voice, gave a short speech. Our dream has always been to be a family, no matter what the world tells us or how it looks at us. The love we have is unbreakable, and that's all we need. For those who are in doubt, for those who still don't believe it's possible, we want you to know, love is the only thing that never fails, no matter the color, the shape, or how it comes. When it's true, it transforms everything. Next to Mike and Margot, he looked at the audience and felt a peace he had long sought. The battle wasn't over, but they knew that, at least for them, the fight had been worth it. The event ended with emotional applause. Many were applauding not only for Max and Mike's fight, but also for Margot's courage, as she was already becoming an advocate for the rights of all families. Max's eyes shone, and Mike hugged him, without words, just feeling the certainty that everything they had faced had finally made them a true family. As they walked home that night, Margot, now 19, walked between her parents, who shared a smile. It was the smile of those who knew. Their lives had changed, but in a way that was more important than anything else. They had each other, and that was enough. The last lesson Margot learned from her parents, the one that marked her most, was simple and profound. No matter what the world expects of you, or what it tries to impose, the love of a family is something no one can destroy. And that's how, over the years, Max, Mike, and Margot built not only a family, but a legacy of love, acceptance, and courage that began to echo far beyond the walls of their home. Their journey, which started with adversity and rejection, ended with the deepest of victories, the understanding that, in the end, love always finds a way.